Dear friends, it has been brought to my attention that something is wrong when it comes to books. Women are reading, young women at that, and they are reading books about dragons that are horny. Meanwhile, men are no longer reading. Clearly, this is the decline of the West. So I, as arbiter of all cultural capital, have taken it upon myself to speak out on the rise of anti-intellectualism in the book sphere. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about something book adjacent. Today we'll be talking about the supposed rise of anti-intellectualism in the book sphere. There have been numerous videos on the subject. People are concerned, and I am concerned too, but about different things. So that's what we'll be talking about today. This is not a direct attack on any specific booktuber, although if you feel attacked, yeah, you probably deserve it, right? I'm not naming names, but I think the discussion is currently going a very, very wrong direction, and there are reasons, fundamental reasons, on why that is the case. So that's what we'll be talking about today. But before we move on, well, I'm not an intellectual. I don't even pretend to be an intellectual. And the good thing about that is, I don't have to dress like this. So let's change into something more suitable. Alright, now that I look the part, let's get started and talk about anti-intellectualism in the book sphere. And we'll do this the following way. First, we'll talk about what anti-intellectualism actually is, and then we'll talk about what most people in the book sphere are talking about when they complain about the rise of anti-intellectualism. And then we'll talk about why the second is happening, why the second is wrong, and what needs to happen if we actually want to talk about anti-intellectualism, which is a thing, and it's actually a thing that is happening, and it's a dangerous thing. So, let's get cracking. Cheers. Alright, anti-intellectualism is kind of hard to define. Now, some people would read books on the subject, for example, Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which, as it happens, I've read twice by now. It hasn't aged well. It's also written in the early 60s, so it has, it misses a lot of context for the modern day, but it does help us to understand what anti-intellectualism is versus, say, a lack of education or intellectual ability or whatever. Anti-intellectualism is, in fact, enmity towards the intellectual, or the fiction of an intellectual, the constructed image of an intellectual. It is very much about common sense and all of these kind of things. It is also, it's opposed to intellectualism and higher education and so forth. And as it happens, that is something that does happen right now a lot. You can talk about, say, dismantling the Department of Education, banning books from libraries, banning books from schools, treating school teachers like shit, going into school boards and forcing people to change their education. Maybe even, talk about no longer talking about evolutionary theory, but maybe teaching the creation myth instead when it comes to the world, and stuff like that. See, it does exist. Anti-intellectualism is, something that has been around ever since, the first two people thought that the third person was actually too smart by half, and it has grown along. Now, there is certainly a specific tradition in the West, and Hofstadter does look at that in Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And since America is certainly what you might call a cultural hegemon, if not more, to large parts of the world through its cultural exports and all of that, we need to talk about that in an American context. So yes, all of the things I just mentioned are connected to US policies, but they have certainly spread across the globe. What is important to understand, however, is that this political crusade, this anti-intellectual crusade, is something that has been going on for a long time. It has been going on since at least the 1960s, ever since school segregation became a thing. You can also talk about the Scopes trial in the 1920s, which is the first time people were talking about why, teaching evolutionary theory is wrong in school, and back then they lost, at least somewhat, and so forth. What is important to understand, however, is that anti-intellectual crusade that has been going on for a long time has always been coming from the right, from two parts of the right. One of them is the Christian right, the far Christian right, that was mostly concerned about, desegregation and all of these kind of things, and they made a very powerful alliance with what you might call the top tiers of capital-owning the capital-owning class, neoliberalists, some people, neoliberals, some people would call them billionaires today, that kind of people. Those were mostly organized in the John Birch Society, for example, and those groups formed a very powerful alliance, attacking school boards from the 1960s onwards, dismantling public education ever since, and that has been going on for a long time. Yes, there has been, attacks on intellectual freedom in communist countries, especially under, say, Stalinism. But since Stalinism doesn't really exist outside of, say, North Korea, we can focus on the far right. So this is a political problem. It is an ongoing, long-running political campaign that has certainly led to, say, less education and a lot of, enmity towards people that are seen as intellectuals, as people that read too many books, that read too much theory, that think too deeply about stuff that can be solved just by common sense and nothing more. That is something that has happened. It also kind of shows in, say, bookish spaces, when you read comments about, more longer video essays about books, and people are complaining, like, why can't you just enjoy the story? Why can't you just focus on this? You are thinking too much about this. Leftists clearly can't enjoy these kind of stories and so forth. Because, and this is fundamental when it comes to what you might call the intellectual versus just someone who's, well-educated, it is about questioning everything. It is about asking uncomfortable questions all the time. Sometimes something good will come out of that. Sometimes nothing will come out of it. But it is the freedom of asking questions and valuing those questions just for the worth of questions. And the problem with that is, of course, that it constantly attacks, say, assumptions, common assumptions, privilege, and all of these kind of things. So that is what anti-intellectualism is. It's the concerted attack on the right to read, think, and so forth, whatever the fuck you want. And it comes from the far right, from the Christian right, and from the capital-owning classes, the billionaire class in particular. Now let's talk about what booktubers think anti-intellectualism is, or what booktubers claim are signs of anti-intellectualism, and then we'll maybe see where all of this is going. Now, a lot of times, a lot of these videos are talking about book talk. Book talk is usually sort of like the boogie person of booktubers, possibly bookstagrammers as well, and the larger press. And in, say, the last year, you've seen a lot of clips on that subject. There's that famous clip where one young woman complains about too many words on a page. That has been making the rounds forever. Put a classist and sexist pin into that one. We'll get to that later. Then there are, of course, clips of people complaining that there is too much description in this book and not enough action, and it's not going fast enough to the action. And that has made the rounds a lot. Once again, it's a young woman complaining about that. Now, there have been men complaining about very much the same thing with epic fantasy books on, say, YouTube in much detail. So put another sexist pin into this one as well. Then there is another part which is about how men are no longer reading fiction, and how genres that are catering towards men are no longer pushed massively by publishers, whereas, say, romantasy and romance is big in mainstream publishers and on Book Talk, and that is clearly a sign that supposedly deeper, more nuanced, more intellectual books are no longer published and no longer read, which is another mark of, whatever. It's seen as anti-intellectualism, but what it is just that there are shifts in popularity. This is usually blamed on Book Talk and Book Talkers and on publishers listening to Book Talkers. So there is that. So put a classist pin in that, to put another racist pin into that, and another, say, sexist pin into that one as well. So these are, some of the main sort of lines of argument when people are talking about supposed anti-intellectualism in the book sphere. There's also a line that is all about, bookfluencers are just showcasing books. It's about consumption. It's about buying as much as possible. No one should ever do, book hauls again, and so forth. Now, obviously, this is highly hypocritical in a lot of ways, so put another classist pin into that one, and possibly a racist one as well, and a sexist one, because these are sort of the main elements there. So, none of this is, in fact, anti-intellectualism, because no one in, say, these Book Talk clips or anyone there is saying that it is wrong to read long books. No one there is, in fact, saying that it is, wrong to read, say, non-fiction, that it is wrong to read classics or anything of the sort. There's enough content on that subject out there. So just from these sort of like arguments, the only thing we can say is that right now, certain genres that are mostly targeted towards younger women are very, very popular and are sort of the thing that the mainstream publishing industry is focusing on. And that is something we can talk about, and we can maybe look at whether that is a good thing or not, but that is not the rise of anti-intellectualism. It is, in fact, rather the opposite, because what we have is lots of people reading books and thinking about those books in one way or another. So when booktubers talk about anti-intellectualism, they're not talking about anti-intellectualism, they're talking about a lack of popularity of the stuff that they are into and the massive popularity of stuff that they are not into, and they're trying to dress it up in terminology that sounds educated, which, is a large part of the problem. So let's talk about why booktubers are fundamentally incapable of talking about actual anti-intellectualism in the book sphere and around the book sphere. And that argument is, it's politics. See, Booktube in particular and other parts of the book sphere have always tried to market themselves as a space free from politics. Yes, you have seen that on Booktube Book Talk as well, where people were complaining right after, the election and so forth, that people are talking about politics and not about books, and you have had people explaining that books have always been political and so forth, but that's as far as it goes. The problem, however, is that you can't talk about anti-intellectualism without talking about politics. You can't talk about, say, the rise of popularity and at least the dominance of romantasy and other genres geared towards younger women in the mainstream publishing industry without talking about capitalism. Those are systems. These are systemic issues, and these are political issues, fundamentally political issues. And as long as you can't do that, the only thing you can do instead is, of course, blame individuals. Now, we live under neoliberalism, and neoliberalism does, of course, focus on the responsibilities of the individual and tries to ignore all of these fundamental systemic sort of underlying conditions that lead to specific things. And this is sort of like where the whole thing becomes incredibly problematic and really enrages me because, let's go through those clips once again and pull out those pins for a second, shall we? So, that first clip that everyone talks about that woman complaining about, too many words on the page. See, there are two ways of reading that specific clip. One of them is she really wants shorter books, or mostly shorter books, easier to read books, simpler books, so to speak. The other one is, of course, books are, laid out in a specific way, and I'm sure all of you have read books that had a shitty layout, that had a much too small print. Like if you buy really cheap classics editions and stuff like that, you know what I'm talking about. If you read university textbooks, you know what I'm talking about. And struggling with typeface and font and layout, page layout, is something that a lot of people, struggle with for all kinds of reasons. Maybe they have struggles with their vision. They have visual impairments of one way or another. Maybe they have some neurodiversities that make it harder to focus on text if it's laid out in that specific way. But that would be a question of accessibility. So what most people talking about this clip are actually doing is they focus on the first one, going look at that, uneducated, dumb woman who wants simple slop and not actually read complex, deep books. And that's a very ableist jump, because it could just as well, be a discussion about book layouts and making books accessible to as many people as possible. But we're not doing that. We're focusing on one individual's inability to read long texts, and we are seeing that as a lack of intellectual quality or an intellectual ability. So pretty bad. So sexist and possibly classist and possibly ableist, that specific judgment. Let's talk about the next one. People complaining that there's too many long descriptions. Now, in a lot of cases, and you can find mostly male white booktubers complaining about books being too slow in pace, having, too long descriptions, and there's not enough action. That is something that a lot of booktubers have complained about, and that's a matter of personal taste. Some books have a slow pace. You read, say, The Dragonbone Chair, a lot of people find that incredibly slow and boring, because nothing much happens for like large parts of that book. That's a matter of taste. That doesn't mean that all you ever need is, fast-paced stories and nothing else. It just means it's a matter of taste. The way this is, however, framed is once again that someone is only focusing on, the action, possibly in romance, that being erotic action, and obviously that is seedy in its own way, and we can, blame someone for wanting, written erotica, wanting to be, aroused, titillated, or whatever else. And we ignore the fact that, like, a lot of men have complained about something similar when all they want is, sword fights. So, once again, what we have here is a classist judgment and a sexist judgment, because we ignore men complaining about the same thing, and we focus on, once again, a young woman. So that's the next part. Now let's talk about men not reading anymore. Now, first of all, that is not necessarily true. Like, there are statistics on the subject, and there's all kinds of reasons on why that is. For example, that for the longest time, we've kind of told men that they need to find jobs that make a lot of money, and that's usually somewhere in STEM or in finance or whatever, and reading and doing whatever, the humanities teach you at university is kind of not masculine. So, while that may be part of it, it's not that there is not, like, abundant books that men can read and can be interested in. They all exist, we know that. It is that a system has fundamentally made it, emasculated the idea of reading. And you can get away with nonfiction. Apparently men read more nonfiction because nonfiction is about education, and it's about facts and not, feelings and so forth. And what we see here is, once again, and that's why sexism comes in again, right? What we see is that reading and intellectual occupations are massively gendered. Men are supposed to be smart and intelligent and read only deep things, whereas women are very emotional, and women are reading, dragon porn, basically. And that is supposedly bad. Now, is that true? No, but it is the underlying assumption when people are complaining about the fact that the rise of romantasy and so forth is, pushing men out of reading. It's not. You can still go and read fucking Robert E. Howard if you want to. Those books are out there. Just because now there's also other stuff does not mean the old stuff does not remain. But it, means that that privilege of, like, all books being targeted at men has been eroded somewhat. And yeah, that's once again, something where, say, both a classist and a sexist element are coming into this discussion that is once again, rooted on something vaguely evil, that being obviously book talk, and everyone on book talk being young and women, and no larger, deeper analysis. Now, we can argue whether, say, publishers, mainstream publishers, focusing heavily on what is trending on book talk and pushing that massively, possibly over-pushing it, leading to bad quality in writing, leading to bad quality in book production and so forth, how that is a problem. We can talk about, say, the short-term profit orientation of late-stage capitalism being, in fact, actually harmful to publishers themselves, and how that is a big of a problem. We can do that, but for that we need to understand and acknowledge that it is a problem of capitalism. It's a fundamental structural problem of capitalism. It's not that, suddenly the big five publishers hate men. That's not what is at the bottom of this, but we need to acknowledge these systemic things. And that is, once again, where this whole thing kind of ties together. Booktube, as a space that has defined itself as non-political and free from politics, is very much incapable of acknowledging these underlying politics, and by ignoring all of that, is actually reinforcing all these political problems that are on the side of anti-intellectualism. If all we do is go out and blame young women on the internet for reading books, or reading books the wrong way, what we create is what we gatekeep. We basically use, class distinction in a lot of ways. We flaunt our cultural capital and push them back into this weird place below us to defend our ever-shrinking, privileges, instead of actually welcoming people and going further. And we don't question, the underlying, say, strategies of, eroding education, eroding the worth of the humanities, of an academic education, eroding the idea of, asking questions no matter whether they turn out to be good questions or bad questions. At the same time, we are not questioning the underlying capitalist system, or, attack, say, the fucking fascists taking over the countries right now and making things even worse. We are, in fact, helping them if we don't acknowledge these political dimensions. So, to bring this all together, Booktube should not talk about anti-intellectualism unless we actually, define what it actually is and we make clear statements. Because if we don't, paint the actual targets, that being, the Christian right, the billionaire right, the capitalist right, the system of capitalism that is slowly failing. If we don't do that, what we actually do is we further the agenda of exactly those kind of people. And you know what? If that's what you want to do, then you're the enemy. And I don't want to, hear you complaining about the rise of anti-intellectualism again, because you are helping those fuckers. So yeah, these are my thoughts on the whole subject. Please just be honest, be political, because this is a political question. If you keep politics out of it, you have no business talking about anti-intellectualism. Have a good day. Let me know what you think. And I don't know, do some political activism and read some books. And until then, the next time, thanks and cheers.